I hear a little muzak still. There we go. Awesome. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Rosen-Wortel, and I have the great honor and privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute and of welcoming you all here today. So thank you for coming. I suspect we're going to have a really terrific conversation about innovative giving strategies with four of the most creative philanthropic leaders we have in this country. I want to say a special word of thanks to Sheena Ashley, our colleague who runs the Center for, yes, cheer, who runs our Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy here, who did a great job of chatting with the philanthropic leaders who are going to be speaking this morning and pulling this event together. And also, as always, thanks to Urban's spectacular events team for all things logistics. They always pull off a beautiful event. Very exciting for us to welcome people to our new home, which I'm going to still saying new home for a little while longer. We've been here for about 5.5 months. The conversation that we're going to have today is one that will certainly extend beyond this room. So I want to encourage everyone perhaps to turn from your emails, but to join the conversation online. So the hashtag live at Urban means that the conversations will all be threaded together. Use that, please, and you'll find on your program that there are the handles for all of our program participants who have them. So if you want to call them out, use those, please, as well. I also want to say a special thanks to our online audience who may be hearing the live stream now. And also, we often get as many more who listen to it over the course of time in the future. So welcome and thank you for tuning in. So for decades, there has been a really sort of powerful bias in the world of philanthropy against thinking about advocacy. It was almost a bit of a dirty word. And there were legal prohibitions on foundation funds being used for lobbying, which meant that foundations sought to fund research and policy development and what the tax law called public education. But advocacy was a concept that many were uncomfortable with. And avoiding it also helped the foundation leaders feel comfortable that they were avoiding the sort of messy world of politics with its changing fates of different leaders over time. But in a world where funders are increasingly being asked by their own leadership and asking of themselves and of journalists and others who study the field, what is it that you're accomplishing? Increasingly, they have to pay attention to how do the ideas that they help to foster become policy. If return on equity isn't great enough, return on equity isn't always great enough if you simply stand back and hope for the ideas that you help to support to take flight and to be adopted. So to maximize impact and leverage resources, we are seeing increasingly more and more have come to understand where are the legal lines around advocacy. There is, lobbying is one thing, but there is a great deal around educating the public and driving ideas for change that even in a very traditional public foundation structure are entirely appropriate. And you see many more foundations starting to think about it. We're also seeing funders, both institutional and individual, taking a range of new approaches to the issues of advocacy. We're seeing them embrace different legal structure and using new entities. We're seeing a noticeable rise in the number of who use the LLC vehicle. But even among those who maintain a traditional public foundation structure, they're increasingly more intentional about their theory of political change and about the ecosystem of grantees that they fund. Some are seeking to create, nurture, and empower new organizations that use and amass political power, not for partisan ends, but to change dynamics around issues and thus to change policy. Some of them are seeking to make sure that the analysis that they support is answering the questions that lawmakers will be taking up. I like to talk about skating to where the puck is going to be, and making sure that the questions that their grantees are asking are those shaped by those who are going to lead in the debate. We're seeing funders who are seeking to ensure that there are relationships between their grantees so that different work products are part of a larger ecosystem of dissemination, so that ideas not simply sit on a website, but get into the public debate. And funders and the grantees are changing themselves in how they engage with policymakers and understand who are the influencers around policymakers that they want to make sure know about and are part of their dialogue. So this is a field that is changing before our eyes. And there are many questions about it, and at least 3 of them, I'm sure, and many more will probably be touched on today. The first of those questions is, what works if you're trying to make sure that your ideas that you're supporting actually change and shape the policy conversation? We're in a moment with a great deal of experimentation, and our knowledge about what works and what has worked in the past but might not be working today has yet to catch up to today's current practice. Understanding how the field is changing is one of the missions of Urban's own Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy. And Sheena's colleague, Ben Saskis, who's here today, has been creating robust case studies of high-impact philanthropic initiatives, some involving advocacy, to study how philanthropy can help make change happen. A second question is, are these changes to the good? No one would quibble with anyone wanting to make sure that their resources are being spent to best effect. But this trend is not without its controversy, as everyone here I'm sure knows. Important questions are being raised about the nature of philanthropic power and how that power intersects with democratic norms and with the values of transparency and accountability. Finally, there are questions about how effective can policy advocacy be in an era of extreme political polarization. Does this phenomenon actually help to advance progress and balance? These are institutions that generally have make a real effort to work with parties across the spectrum. But building support, and does building support for what works, what is sort of evidence-based policy, actually help us to elevate the policymaking process away from some of its worst instincts at this moment? Or does it somehow or other magnify or intensify partisanship and stalemate? We're not going to get clear, crisp, definitive answers to any of those questions, but that is, I think, one of the most interesting debates happening in philanthropy today, and we're going to at least get a really great start of it. My colleague Sheena will introduce the spectacular panel we have of philanthropic leaders who are all thinking about this problem differently and really leading to this outcome of evidence-based, high-quality policy. But before they join them, I'm going to ask Sheena just to tell us a little bit about framing the conversation and some of the trends we're seeing in philanthropy. Thank you all for being here. For those of you coming in, there are some seats up in the front. Please come on in. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Sarah, for kicking us off and getting us started for an engaging conversation today. I just want to sort of provide a little bit of comment around, just to set some context around the language around today, so we don't have to backtrack for this in the presentations for the panel, but also to echo some of the sentiment that Sarah shared in her opening remarks. I will start by also extending a welcome to all of you. What a fantastic turnout to this event. So many people interested in this dialogue and conversation, and we hope to continue this going as we pursue this work together with you. So many partners for the center in the audience today. Thank you for the resources that you provide in educating philanthropists, both institutional and individual philanthropists, to help them get smarter about what's possible in advocacy. Thank you. I have the real privilege here at the Urban Institute in leading the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy. So many of my team members are in the audience. Thank you for your work in pulling this together. Here at Urban, the center is responsible for pulling together the rich expertise that exists across the building to provide nonprofit and philanthropic leaders with the highest quality of actionable evidence to inform their strategy and improve their performance. And it is here where we work alongside many of you that are here today to provide data and insights on nonprofit and philanthropic activity. We've been doing this for the past 2 decades, and we'll continue to do this as we go through Urban's Next 50. And so we are really delighted to host this conversation today. As Sarah mentioned, it is evident that philanthropy is in a remarkable era of expansion and experimentation. More wealth holders are engaging in philanthropy earlier in their lives and more deeply. Many are becoming quite proactive, as we've seen, in pursuing policy agendas and expanding concepts of how policy impact occurs. Some donors are developing hybrid organizations that blend charitable, social welfare, and for-profit functions, and others are repurposing corporate entities to attack problems through politics and policy advocacy. And still others, in more traditional foundation forms, are starting to work more together through collaborative arrangements to leverage resources for policy change. And in this renewed interest in experimentation and advocacy, it is bringing philanthropy into discussions of economic and political inequality, representation, and democracy. There are concerns about the role of wealthy donors and the potential for their unequal wealth to give them outsized voice. There's also concern about the interests, whose interests they represent, and whether the public has any real opportunity for input. And this has all invigorated long-standing concerns about legitimacy, accountability, and transparency. Recent studies by political science scholars, which I'm so happy that we have more interest in the political science field, is really starting to take on interest in philanthropy. But their studies indicate that more philanthropists, both in traditional forms and new forms, are starting to engage in advocacy. And many have become much more emboldened as policy entrepreneurs. But we know through the field's best estimates of advocacy activity that the involvement is still pretty low. This, to me, is one of the real interesting paradoxes that philanthropy faces today. They are attacked on the one hand for being increasingly focused on the possibilities of policy change and having the potential for disproportionate power, but also on the other for not being active enough, for being too passive and resistant to get involved in the policy arena in an urgent way. Now, we all know that wealthy donors and philanthropic organizations can and do play an important role in reforming public policy and public services, and also in funding many of you, the community and civic organizations that are committed to democratic ideals, minority views, and marginalized communities. In many ways, they both challenge and collaborate with government to create public value. Indulge me for just a quick moment while I provide a little one-on-one. This is the academic hat coming out here, just so that we have a level playing field of shared understanding of what's permissible activity in the context of advocacy, lobbying, and electoral activity, so that we enter the conversation with this shared understanding. Now, the U.S. Internal Revenue Code gives institutional philanthropy significant latitude to have a point of view on policy outcomes. This is not arguable. There are so many ways that philanthropy can be involved in advocacy, and advocacy means a lot of different things, as you can see on this slide. There's opportunity to support research, to shape the public debate, build relationships with legislators, educate legislators, meet with legislators to develop the scope of and to discuss the scope of the foundation's work, train grantees on how to lobby, pursue policy changes through litigation, sign amicus briefs. There's so many different functions. When we talk about advocacy, we're talking about this big tent of advocacy activities that are permissible. When we start to move into the context of lobbying, which is one form of advocacy, not complete, but is one small portion of that, we begin to start seeing some distinction in what's allowable in different philanthropic forms. And this opens up the conversation to maybe why we're starting to see changes in structural arrangements that allow philanthropic dollars to be pursued in lobbying in different ways. As you can see, there's more restrictions on private foundations in terms of lobbying activities than there are for community foundations or 501c4 social welfare organizations, and then also LLC forms, which Sarah mentioned in our discussion. The really clear and important distinction here is that foundations are not really allowed to engage in direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying, except for self-defense lobbying that they have. And finally, we also see these distinctions carrying forward in election-related activities. As you'll see, there are absolutely prohibitions, and let me say that again, absolute prohibitions on foundations, both public and private, from being involved in supporting or opposing a candidate for public office. This constraint is for all 501c3 organizations. But we see LLCs having a little bit more flexibility to engage in political activity than private foundations may have. But there are some election-related activities that foundations and philanthropists of all kinds can engage in terms of voter education activities and voter registration activities that are also shared across the spectrum. Hopefully that's helpful. We will share those slides online for anyone who needs this brief tutorial to share with your board members or to just have a quick slide to reference for permissible activities. This helps me a lot to reference this material and to have it all in a particular place. But just wanted to make sure to share that as sort of even ground rules for the discussion that we will have moving into the panel. And now to this impressive and interesting panel. I know that I am standing in the way from a very intriguing dialogue between 4 of the nation's leading philanthropic leaders. And I must say that I am so pleased that we have enlisted Phil Buchanan to moderate this dynamic group of panelists. Phil and the Center for Effective Philanthropy have been key knowledge generators in this space through surveys and conversations with philanthropic leaders about their policy advocacy ambitions and their impact. And I am so certain that he will guide us in a thoughtful discussion today. So join me in welcoming Phil and the panelists to kick off what you came for, this panel discussion.
Hello, everyone. All right. Well, I want to start by thanking the folks at the Urban Institute, and in particular, Sarah and Sheena and Jocelyn and Ben and all the other folks who I met in the last half hour whose name I don't remember. Great to see everyone. We really do have a great panel. And I think Sarah and Sheena did a really good job of setting it up. And so I'll say less in terms of framing than I had planned to. It is a little confusing though, right? Because you hear all of these things that are sort of contradictory. Foundations, donors aren't focused enough on systems. They're just focused on Band-Aids. So they really need to do more policy and advocacy work, and they really haven't been doing it. Oh, no. Doing policy advocacy work is totally anti-democratic, and who are donors to decide what the best policy priorities are. When I started in this field a little less than 2 decades ago, the left of center funders would sort of lament that the conservatives were really good at this stuff. They knew how to change the policy game, but the left of center funders weren't. But then you would talk to right of center funders, circa 2014, 2015, and they'd say, boy, the left of center funders, laid the groundwork for Obamacare, and they were so effective in the marriage equality campaign, and they really know what they're doing. So all these contradictions. And then, of course, another contradiction is that I think it is true that some of the greatest successes, at least as I would define them, it's subjective, obviously, right? But areas where we could say, boy, philanthropy really made a difference, have to do with policy change. So whether that be folks who might not be household names, like Mary Lasker, who was a donor who was married to a ad executive who I think did the ads for Lucky cigarettes, and then she became a very prominent philanthropist that really shaped the government's approach to medical research and cancer research, but also other disease, or whether it be RWJF's role in helping to drive down smoking rates in the 90s, or whether it be, as I already alluded to, the work of Gill and Haas Jr. and others on marriage equality. So in some ways you say, well, is this a new playbook policy? Maybe not. And then on the other hand, also, when we think about some of the more sort of disappointing, failures, they often have to do with a policy approach. So think about Dale Russakoff's book, The Prize, and what went wrong in the Zuckerberg $100 million, $200 million with the Challenge Grant initiative to change public schools, and who was really consulted and who wasn't, and who was engaged and who wasn't, and so on. So lots of contradictions here for us to explore, maybe particularly in this moment. And I think folks are right to say, boy, there is more critique right now. And as Ben always points out, there's always been, Ben, the historian from Urban, always points out there's always been critique. And even in recent years, we have books like Megan Tompkins Stage's Policy Patrons, for example, or Diane Ravitch's books about education, where she laments the Billionaires Boys Club that sort of preceded the current wave of pushback. So we at CEP are in the midst of a study on larger foundations' approach to policy. We've done a survey. We're doing a bunch of interviews. I'm not really supposed to say much about it, but I will say that what we do see in response to that survey we conducted, and there may be some response bias, right? You're doing a survey about policy, but it's the overwhelming number, more than 90% of foundations say that they do policy advocacy, and they overwhelmingly say it's crucial to the achievement of their goals. They also say, almost 3/4, that they have intensified those efforts in the last 3 years, in particular at the state and local levels. So that's a little bit of the landscape in terms of all of the discussions and debate and what's going on. And now we're gonna have a conversation about all this, and hopefully learn something about how each of these leaders is approaching this, and engage some of the debates of the day. So Kelly Rhee is the CEO of the Arnold Foundation. Brian Hooks leads the Charles Koch Foundation. Malenka Clark is the CEO of Hudson Weber Foundation. And Mark Rigdon is the Deputy Director of State and Local Government Relations at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Let's start maybe with you, Kelly, with just, and I'm going to do a lot of interrupting, but in a polite way. But sort of brief from each of you. What is your approach to policy advocacy? Why do you do it, and how do you seek to do it? Starting with you at the Arnold Foundation.
So Phil, you, Sheena, Sarah have all talked about the questions around whether or not philanthropy has too much power, too little accountability, and yet a responsibility to actually do something. I think those criticisms and I think the pressure to act are valid. And so we have spent the last 2 years doing some real soul searching, asking ourselves, are we doing enough with the influence and the dollars that we have to actually make a difference? And so through that soul searching process, I think like all of my panelists, we already knew this, but it became clear we can never outspend any of the problems that we care about and are trying to address. And so we have to think about driving change differently. We were founded almost 10 years ago, and we said we were about policy change, and we were. But the way that we impacted policy was really funding fabulous research, to give policymakers evidence of what works and what doesn't. And that's important, that's necessary, and we are not walking away from that strategy. But we realized there was a big handoff that needed to be made between the evidence that's generated and actually implementing policy in a complicated political environment. And so we said, okay, if we want to be about actually doing something that matters, if we want to have more impact than just the dollars we can give, how do we go about driving policy change? And so we restructured ourselves as an LLC so that we can do the charitable giving that we've always done and actually do more of it, but we can also engage either directly or through our grantees in the political side of policymaking.
And Kelly, just to stick with you for a moment, I mean, one of the critiques is sort of who decides, right? And so if we're to look at the boards, for example, of the private foundations represented here, they are quite small, and they are really in no particular way diverse at all, right? So how do you think about who decides what the right policy priorities are, and how to hear from, or do you seek to hear from the people who would ultimately be affected by whatever the policy priorities are?
I completely agree with your criticism. I think there is one distinct advantage of small boards. We can move fast. And so that is helpful. But I hear you that who are we to say that this is how a problem should be solved? This is how the field should move forward. And that is where we really look to data and evidence to help us determine where to go. And you know, we have an amazing team at Arnold Ventures, but we're not going to outthink any of these issues. We're not any smarter than anybody else who is trying to solve the same problems. And so we do make sure that we not only engage with others who have worked in the field, who are working in the field, but we make an effort to engage directly with the communities with whom we're trying to work and to benefit. A great example of that is some of the prison work that we are moving forward with partners like Urban, the Vera Institute, Ladies of Hope Ministries. We are really thinking long and hard about how do we bring together all of the voices to make sure that we have evidence-based solutions to drive real impact and change.
Great, thanks. Brian, give us your take on how the Koch Foundation approaches policy advocacy. Why do you do it? How do you do it?
Sure. Excuse me. And the way that we talk about policy advocacy really isn't from the Koch Foundation. It's from an organization that we call Stand Together.
Yep.
And this is a group that's been around for a long time. We announced the name change to Stand Together back in May because it really describes the way that we're approaching everything that we do these days, and especially relevant to the way that we're approaching policy advocacy. I know this is a discussion about policy advocacy. I'm going to talk about it, but I think one of the things that we take to heart is that the problems that we're addressing as a philanthropy, as they Stand Together, are problems that are holding people back in many different ways across society. And so while policy has an important role to play, it can't just be about policy. So I think there's a risk that we over-index for the importance of public policy in thinking about what philanthropy can do to help empower people to overcome the barriers that are holding people back. So I describe our approach as comprehensive. We want to keep in mind the role that public policy plays in problems that are, say, as complex as persistent poverty or mass incarceration, something I hope we'll talk more about today, or economic opportunity. These are complex problems, and as we approach them, we have to recognize that not any of them have a single solution, and not any of them will be solved by public policy advocacy on its own. So thinking about the role that policy plays in that overall equation, we look at what are the key areas of society that we ought to be investing in, or we ought to be partnering with people to invest in, to make sure that we can make the greatest difference in helping people to improve their lives. And we've got a fairly simple way of thinking about this, but we found it to be pretty effective. We take an example like criminal justice reform, something that I think a lot of people in this room, certainly the Urban Institute and my colleagues up here, have been involved in. Absolutely, you've got to change the laws. People who shouldn't be in jail should not be in jail, and that's a matter of public policy change. But if that's where we stop and we celebrate, we've failed the people that we're seeking to help. The problems of criminal justice reform are society-wide. And so while we advocate for policies like the First Step Act in a coalition with a diverse group of organizations and individuals, we also say, look, once people get out of jail, we need to be investing in nonprofits, community organizations to help ensure that they find a successful path in life. But that's not enough either. Right? So the business community has a critical role to play. I think philanthropy can help to rally the business community. Many of the people that sit on these small boards have standing in the business community. So for instance, we have a partnership with Richard Branson and the Society for Human Resource Management to help people who are returning from prison to become employed, because we know that's the most likely way that they'll stay out of prison, but more importantly, find a successful path in their lives and for their families. And then we think about the role that education can play in this as well. And so most of what we do, and certainly what the Charles Koch Foundation does, is invest in education. You take a project like the one that we support at Arizona State University, headed by this phenomenal professor, a guy named Eric Luna, who had the bright idea to not reinvent the wheel in terms of best practices when it comes to improvements in the criminal justice system, but to collect over 100 scholars from universities across the country who have been doing this research for decades and put together a compendium out of a research center at ASU that we helped him to start, so that we're not reinventing the wheel every time we want to reform the criminal justice system. So we describe our approach as comprehensive, and we want to make sure that for whatever challenge, whatever barrier we're trying to address, we're bringing the right investments to the table to increase the likelihood, not just that we'll succeed in the short term, but that success will be sustained over the long term.
Okay. I'm going to skip over Malenka and come to her last, just because her approach differs in the sense that it's very much rooted in a place.
Yep.
So sticking at sort of federal policy level, maybe a little bit more here first with Mark. Certainly the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has experienced its share of critique, particularly with respect to education. I mentioned Diane Ravitch before, who was maybe one of the earliest kind of vocal critics of what she called the Billionaire Boys Club. And I think her argument was basically that, you know, who is this foundation to set priorities for schools that have traditionally been locally controlled in this country. I imagine that folks at the foundation have wrestled with that critique. You remain really focused on policy. So how do you think about that, and how do you think about it in light of some of the critique?
Sure. Well, the critique is an important conversation that's going on both externally and internally in the foundation. So we take it seriously, and we use the various perspectives to inform the work that we do. We're, you know, along the lines of a comprehensive approach to addressing and trying to innovate to solve problems. So on the programmatic side, our colleagues are investing in the development of new programs and approaches that we hope will make significant inroads in terms of creating improved education outcomes in the context of much of our domestic U.S. Work. And then on my team, we, you know, on the policy and advocacy side, we're really about trying to understand what lessons learned and best practices we can extract from those programmatic investments and models, and use that to help educate and inform policymakers about how they might think about scaling some of what we're seeing that's working. We don't pretend that everything that we're investing in necessarily is going to be successful, but we think it's important to try and think about more than just incremental improvements. And so in the context of all that, we increasingly try not to act alone, so that our work is informed through the broad and diverse collaborations that we have with partners domestically and globally. So I think I would make the argument that we really are acting in concert with a lot of people who are helping inform our thinking about how to approach the development of solutions for vexing issues and challenges in their communities.
I remember, I think it was the 2018 Q&A with Bill and Melinda Gates, or the annual letter, where Melinda Gates, I think, spoke to this explicitly in terms of the need to hear from folks in schools, teachers, families. How are you doing that?
Well, if you look at our education portfolio right now, what you'll see is that the cornerstone of our education investments are built around something called networks for school improvement. And unlike some of the approaches that we've invested in the past that sort of have a prescribed preset models, the NSI, as we call it, initiative is really built around trying to provide support for schools that are looking at new innovative ways to facilitate continuous improvement. We've not gone into this project with a preset model of how that has to happen or the participants in that process, what kind of data you need to use, et cetera. And over the next, the first 3 to 5 years of that project, we're learning along with our partners as we make these grants about what's working and how those models are evolving in ways that better serve improved education outcomes. At the end of that time, with the help of external evaluators who are looking at all of this work as it unfolds, we'll make a decision about, in collaboration with our partners, about what are the most promising elements of this work that we've seeded and what implications do they have potentially for growing effective networks and for shaping policies that can create the kinds of incentives that facilitate effective continuous improvement. So I think that's a pretty good example of where we've learned some lessons from our previous approaches, and we've created an investment initiative that really seeks to have an open opportunity to suggest and surface best practices.
Great. Malenka, you are working locally. You're at Hudson Weber Foundation, which is a little bit less of a household name, perhaps, than the others on the panel. So can you start by orienting us a little bit to who you are and what you do, and then how you are pursuing policy advocacy work?
Thank you, and I'd be happy to. Thank you for that. So the Hudson Weber Foundation, yes, one of these things is not like the other. We are a place-based independent foundation in Detroit. The foundation, and I'll spend a little time on this because it's important, I think, to a larger point, but we have a very long history in the city. You know, if you look at the predecessor foundations, we've been around since 1939. The legacy of our foundation is in turn, you know, built on the legacy of the Hudson and Weber families that ran the J.L. Hudson department stores, a much beloved institution in Detroit and beyond, frankly. And I underscore that point in part because it's that reputational capital that I've been trying to be thoughtful about deploying in these new conversations that we're entering. So our foundation, our mission is to improve the quality of life in Detroit. I came in as president about 3 years ago, and together with the trustees deployed a new strategy that was really about building shared and enduring prosperity in the city. And that means, you know, quality jobs, quality housing, safe and thriving communities. We have a very broad portfolio and a limited number of dollars. And because we were sort of taking these issues of access and opportunity head on, we really had to be intentional about addressing structural barriers to opportunity. And we had to take this journey as a board about where we were going to situate ourselves vis-a-vis trying to have impact. And there was no way to even consider having impact without putting policy front and center. And we, you know, for us, we probably the most intentional declaration where folks really in our community kind of stood up and said, oh, Hudson Weber's in this space, is with the statewide convening on criminal justice policy that we held last fall, the Michigan Roundtable on Safety and Justice. And we made a decision, you know, we could have given money to an organization to host it, but we were very intentional about putting our name on it, co-hosting it with partners, and sort of ironically, like I was quick to think about what's the center of right organization to kind of bring into the fold, channeling my history as a, you know, coming from the Brennan Center and the Legal Defense Fund as a policy advocate, and then the Obama administration. I'm like, we need to get that partner. But the sort of the whole premise is that Hudson Weber doesn't have an ideological brand. And frankly, our board, though not diverse in the ways that I think you're alluding to, there are 16 trustees, and they are, you know, not at the extremes ideologically, But they are a diverse group in that sense. We certainly have Republicans and Democrats on our board. And that informs sort of how we approach this work generally. But anyway, in that instance, we of course then picked our center of left organization too, because we needed both to have that balance. And then we issued a report of consensus recommendations that again had our name on it. And that work has led to increased work in that area that I'd like to talk to. But I would just say that the nuance and the challenges that have been surfaced, I think, are certainly just as real for organizations that are rooted in the ground. But I think those challenges and opportunities, have a different nuance for sure because of where we're situated.
Yeah, and how do you think in the community in which you work about it? Who's informing your choice about what policy goals to pursue? How do those goals emerge? Who do you listen to?
So I think, the way we've entered this space is not to think so much about issue-specific goals, although our work might move in that direction, but certainly to think about what is the enabling environment to make good policy outcomes. And we're hyper-focused on the ecosystem in our community and our state, frankly. Even though we're a Detroit funder, we've had to lift our eyes to the statewide work. And so, what is the support that's needed for the, top flight advocacy organizations and also the grassroots mobilizing organizations? And how do we convene spaces and make linkages so that those folks are channeling together and bringing people power? And how are we having the data? We're doing data and policy development too to have the evidence base. But it has to be, for our long-term stake in this community, it has to be about that ecosystem. And our view has to be pretty far out in the future to sort of know that what we're working on, and we cannot work on this alone. And frankly, we also need national partners in this space, but that we can see impact.
Yeah, so this is interesting because it segues into something I wanted to ask about, which is structures and approaches, right? So Arnold has recently created an LLC, as I understand it. Bill and Melinda Gates created a C for, Brian, you talked about the multiple entities through which you're pursuing your work. And then Malenka, you just talked about supporting the infrastructure and the other organizations that are required for a good policy environment. And I was thinking about Sheena's presentation at the beginning and the fact that actually 501c3s have a fair amount of latitude. And I mentioned before, one of the, that I heard a lot, particularly in my early years at CEP, people saying like, the conservative foundations are very good at just providing general operating support to organizations whose goals aligned with theirs and just letting them go. And so I'm curious just how you all think about this. Like, so who's doing the policy advocacy work? Like, are you directly doing it? Are you supporting nonprofits to do it? Is it a mix? And why have you decided on the structures that you have? Kelly, maybe I'll start with you just because of the LLC choice.
So yes, we made the decision to move to an LLC model, knowing that there was plenty of policy and advocacy work we could do as a private foundation. But we wanted our structure to not inhibit our ability to fund organizations to be effective in advocating for various efforts to move forward. So we went with kind of the most aggressive organizational structure to enable us to do that. We are still figuring out what our approach to advocacy looks like.
Yep.
So I speak from months of experience, not years.
Right.
But funders are good at many things, but we are not necessarily the best operator or the best advocate ourselves. And there are groups who the issues that they are advocating for, their passion for it, their knowledge of it, their work in the field is deeper in ways that we are not. And so our primary vehicle for advocating and moving things forward is to fund others to do that work.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. Brian or Mark, you want to speak to your structures?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. So obviously the foundation operates under a C4 structure. The role that my team as a government relations team plays, our currency is relationships with key decision makers. And so we enjoy the ability to have access to folks that some of our partners don't always have that equivalent kind of access. So I think we would describe our role as helping to make sure that we can open doors so that more diverse voices are participating in critical conversations about critical policy issues that are a priority for us. Bill and Melinda did make a decision this spring to establish a C4 that obviously sits separate from the C3. And that's a very nascent enterprise right now that is in the midst of being stood up. We're still trying to sort of figure out what that's going to focus on, but it just adds a tool to the advocacy tool belt that the Gates can access and allows them to have conversations about specific pieces of legislation potentially in a way that under the C3 we're restricted from doing. So I think they're interested in learning to see what that tool will allow them to do and what kind of value it would add to their advocacy efforts.
How about you, Brian?
Yeah, I'll add, and I'm very interested in the different models that everybody is trying out, because I think, as Kelly said, you may be months in, I'm years in, we're still learning every day in terms of where we can be most effective. But the framework that we use is we want to bring the capital to the table that is most useful to the groups or individuals that we're supporting, that we're empowering to basically do what they do, and try to be very conscious of that division of labor in a sense, right? Understand that for almost every single issue that we address, the groups that we're supporting are the experts, and we're not.
Right.
We can be helpful and we can be partners, and we work really hard to try to figure out how we can partner. So we think about structure in that way, right? I mean, what is it that the group needs to be most effective? And let's not ask them to conform to our structure. Let's figure out how we can be most supportive to them. Give you just a couple of quick examples for where I think we're most effective when we do this. So in public policy advocacy, one of the groups that we support is Americans for Prosperity, which is a grassroots organization, one of the largest grassroots organizations in the country. Millions of citizens from across the country who are passionate about policy, but absent the kind of organization like Americans for Prosperity, their voice it would be very difficult for their voice to have an impact, to make a difference. But this is our way of helping millions of people to elevate their voice in public policy conversations that are too often dominated by the coasts, by this city, and often by the extremes. And so you look at where this can make a huge difference. This past November in Florida, Americans for Prosperity joined with the ACLU on something called Initiative 4, which was an effort to restore voting rights to people who had served their time for having been convicted for a felony. It's a law that was way past due. Florida was one of 4 states that hadn't already made this reform. We went on to subsequently work in Tennessee to try to pass it there as well. The effectiveness of being able to have Americans for Prosperity and ACLU coming together to do something that just made sense for the people of Florida, the results in a very close election is that this initiative passes with well over 60% of the vote. And so I attribute that kind of effectiveness to the model of really being able to bring the right capital to the table for the right opportunity, but always with an eye towards empowering those people who are best situated to understand the situation and advocate for the right policy.
I want to ask you about something that I think relates, because criminal justice reform is sort of the, as far as I can tell, like the one thing that people point to first as an example of folks working across the partisan divide, and then like it's hard to find the second or third, right? And you had written a piece, I think it was in the Post maybe recently, in which you talked about, you advocated for more of a focus on partnership, not partisanship. I mean, is that, I prepared them, I'm very blunt. Is that just kind of naive? I mean, is that realistic right now?
There's a reason we come back to criminal justice reform, because up until about 18 months ago, and many of you who worked on this experienced this, That was a fair question on criminal justice reform. For 25 years, this was an impossible issue. So it was naive to be engaging on it, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. And now there's a movement to do even more. We need to do a whole lot more on criminal justice reform, as people know. I'll give you the second and the third, and I think there's a fourth and a fifth as well, if we have a chance to get into it.
Okay, educate me.
I think immigration is absolutely right for this kind of issue. This is an issue that we are very engaged on right now. And while the extremes are still characterizing the surface of the conversation, there's a ton of energy on this issue by people of all different perspectives and ideologies, political stripes, who want the same thing, which is a reasonable approach to immigration. More people who can come to contribute and secure borders. No reason why we can't have both of those things. 80% of the American people agree in it. Philanthropy, I think, has an opportunity to bring those voices to the fore so we don't let the 5% at the extremes characterize it. I think foreign policy is another issue where for a long time we've had a consensus that doesn't seem to be going very well. I mean, when you look objectively at the outcomes of the U.S. positioning in the world. So let's do something different. And I think a lot of people feel that way. Now, we're not presuming to know the answer, just like with criminal justice reform. Had we come to the table and said, the First Step Act or the highway, we wouldn't have gotten anywhere. But we said, hey, let's figure out how to do something different. And so I think I don't think it's naive. I think it is new, and that's scary to people who are entrenched in the current system. But that's something that I think philanthropy can help to shake up. Let's take some risks to push the boundaries.
And I would add to that list, there is an opportunity for folks across the aisle to come together to address the out-of-control cost of prescription drugs. It's a new area for philanthropy and one that I hope we have new partners come to the table soon. But right now, down the street, both in Congress, the House, and the White House are considering opportunities to do something. And to do something that helps everyday citizens. And I think that, you said it so well, Brian, this is an opportunity, and I actually consider it a responsibility that philanthropy look for places to bring different points of view together, particularly on an issue where the public is crying out for action.
Malinka, is this easier to do at the local level, do you think?
I think it is. I think that a lot of sort of our locus point obviously is county and city government. The partisanship is not the issue. It's actually, I think the true issue is this sense of, philanthropy and for stakeholders that are actually moving decisions. Are we walking with the appropriate humility to understand and hold ourselves accountable for actually representing people's voices? And I think in Detroit in particular, where the population is so disenfranchised, the poverty is so deep. We as a local funder, I think can hold that, we're all holding the mirror up to ourselves, but I think that it is incumbent on us in particular to make sure that we're doing that right. And I think for us, that's the hard work. And so that question of sort of how we navigate, certainly for our criminal justice strategy, we're really interested and been learning a lot about pooled funds in other places. But we've made some investment that includes as the central sort of grant-making strategy to literally engage, what we would consider to be anchor organizations around what we come up with. And then, together see if we can get funding for that from other key partners. That is, a strategy that I think is going to play dividends and is the only way we should do it. At the same time, we're navigating the fact that, we're an inside player too, and we shouldn't leave those cards off the table. And so, for example, Thursday actually, so we put some investment in a study of the drivers of the Wayne County jail population with the Vera Institute of Justice to get the Wayne County stakeholders, the prosecutor's office, the sheriff, the police department, the judiciary. All those players took individual meetings with myself and Vera, with not a community representative in the room, but for us, kind of trying to pull that coalition together and then making the space to bring community partners in. And I think both those strategies are right. They're hard to navigate, but that's part of the work.
Got it. There are, I think, sheets of paper or cards for you to write your questions. You probably figured that out already, but and there are staff from Urban Institute who are collecting those, and we will open it up to questions in a bit here. I guess I want to ask, maybe just channel the harshest critic and say, and see how you would react. And maybe I'll aim this one at you, Mark, and you, Kelly. So, so folks would look at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and say, okay, we had breaking large high schools into small high schools. We had teacher performance and connecting that to compensation potentially. We had Common Core. And in each case, the hoped for sort of outcomes were not achieved. I think, again, please correct me if I'm wrong, by the foundation's own assessment. And so what would you say to someone who says, okay, why should we trust you then to pursue a policy advocacy agenda in light of those examples that I just gave? What would be the argument back that you would make?
Well, education reform is hard, and particularly for an organization like ours. We're gonna make some big bets. We're gonna make sure that we are in conversations with folks and grounding them in sort of appropriate conceptions of how solutions need to be structured and play out. And then we're gonna invest in helping to test them. And that's sort of a unique reality that philanthropy can play. It's true, we're not, there is this tension that we exist in. We're not accountable to shareholders. We don't have to answer to voters. But at the same time, we do have this opportunity to use a critical mass of resources in collaboration with partners to try and do some things that both on the public sector side and on the private sector side, the incentives have not aligned properly in order to try and generate effective solutions. So I think what I would say is, yes, absolutely, not everything that we've invested in has panned out the way that we had hoped it would. But we are committed and remain committed to working with parents, students, educators, communities to try and find solutions that will generate the kinds of improvements in education outcomes that we all know and want for America's youth.
And do you think the lessons from those examples that I mentioned have been sort of distilled and internalized at the foundation?
I absolutely think so. Bill and Melinda have spent a considerable amount of time mining the data and the evaluations of the work that they've invested in over the past 15 plus years, and that absolutely informs their perspectives and their thinking about what the foundation can do on a go-forward basis. And I think, as I mentioned in the context of the NSI example, we've learned some important lessons about being open and going in and allowing different solutions to emerge from an investment initiative. We're going to continue to learn, but I think the important thing is that because we've experienced some failures, we're not going to run away from the enormity of the challenge. This is really, really important work that's critical to Bill and Melinda's vision of what they want their legacy to be.
Thanks. And Kelly, I guess I would ask you a similar question, knowing that you haven't been there years and years. So I had a conversation, and there was nothing particularly private about the conversation, so I think I could share it with someone who worked at the foundation a number of years ago, before you were there, who said...
I've been there 6.5 years.
Okay, well, so maybe it was around it. Anyway, it wasn't you.
I don't think it was me.
And this person was telling me that about the promise of investments in algorithms that would guide judges with respect to sentencing, and that this would remove the opportunities for racial bias in sentencing. And this staff person was super excited about it and saying, this is great. And then I read a ProPublica, investigative piece that said basically actually the algorithms embedded racial bias. You can tell me if you think I've misconstrued anything, but I think I would ask the same question that I asked Mark. Like, was that a mistake, in your view, that was avoidable, or have lessons been learned from that? And should people be skeptical looking at something like that about then the sort of suggestion that, no, we're really going to focus on policy and advocacy going forward?
So let me start by, I know the ProPublica article well, and let me start by framing my take on whether or not risk assessment is racially biased, because unfortunately we don't definitively know.
Okay.
There is emerging data that suggests it is not, but we have a bigger problem. The criminal justice system is racially biased. It is a system where people of color, people of color face disproportionate challenges, not only because they encounter the criminal justice system more frequently than others, but because they receive different treatment. And so I don't think we can, pin any sort of racial bias on risk assessment in particular, but I think it's something we have to take very seriously, because the system itself isn't working,
right,
and it's certainly not working for people of color. We learned a lot in our work with the public safety assessment, and it's an initiative that we still continue to move forward. And I think some of the things that we learned is that it's not a panacea. It is not an answer to not only give judges and police officers a tool to make objective decisions, but it won't solve all of the challenges that the system faces, particularly at that pretrial phase. But we do think it is an important part and component of the broader bail reform movement. So I'm not sure I'm directly answering your question. We did learn a lot. We learned a single investment isn't the answer. We did learn that it is a part of a bigger movement. We did learn some humility in that, we need to think more broadly about reform. We need to think about other dynamics that come into play in driving change.
Yeah, Malika.
If I would, I also would just add, just hearing the two stories, that, isn't it particularly philanthropy's place to fail, yeah. Right? And I just think that, without a doubt, of all the many constituents that can advance innovation and try new things, philanthropy obviously is the best situated for all the reasons that it's challenging, the lack of accountability and no shareholders and the rest of it. But it provides the space to make big, bold bets. And some of those, frankly, you're probably doing something wrong if you're not having things that are not working out. It means you're not taking big enough risks. And I think certainly for our part of the ecosystem, the smaller foundations who are innovative in their own right, so let me represent them well, but I think, we with our long, storied histories can also learn from not feeling small.
Yeah, I agree with that
Trying big.
completely. And we see ourselves as funders of innovation. And because of the limited accountability that we have, we think we should support government and broader reform movements by pushing envelopes in ways that others are limited. Now, that being said, we take it seriously that when we try something, there are real lives that are impacted. And so this isn't a, yep, that sounds good, let's give that a go. We look to data and evidence. We experiment and pilot in very small and manageable ways to ensure that the innovation is done in a way that's responsible.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Before we open it up to questions, I guess I'd like to try to turn us a little bit toward the really pragmatic. And so you all have been working at this. You have a mix of folks in the room, I think, in terms of nonprofit leaders, funders, others. But if you were speaking to someone establishing a foundation, thinking about, how to approach policy advocacy, based on your own experience, your own lessons learned, is there a piece of advice or two that you would provide that new donor or new foundation president? anyone can start.
I'm happy to start. I think that in our soul-searching process, we got really clear about what is unique about our situation that we have some responsibility to bring to the table. And because I work for living co-founders who are young and who are aggressive and who are willing to take risks, we felt responsibility and an opportunity to use that to drive impact and change. So I would say to someone thinking about what they do next or what they want to do, what is it that you uniquely bring to the table that is going to make the biggest difference to leave the world better than you found it?
Thanks, Kelly.
So I would just say, listen to people like Malinka and Kelly, because you all probably know this, but for me, this is not the way that most philanthropy has thought about things, at least as I understand it, for a long time. So I think this focus on humility, which is a word that's come up here a lot, is so important, but it's not really the way that philanthropy has been wired for a long time. I think this focus on experimenting, but being very intentional and respectful about how we think about experimenting in a social world, right? Because we are talking about people's lives and the opportunity to help people improve. And when you miss that opportunity, that's a big deal. But structuring that learning, and then I think sharing knowledge too, which is, again, not something that I think has been the norm in the philanthropic community. But we shouldn't make the same mistake, right? We should make new ones, and you should learn from our mistakes, and we should learn from yours. And I think you're seeing a little bit more of that. But I would say to anybody that's coming into this field, lean into that kind of trend. Take more risks, but do it in the spirit of kind of openness and all of us being in this together and learning, rather than sort of what I think has been for a long time kind of the old playbook, which is sort of experts from afar making decisions for other people, which doesn't strike me as the right approach.
Great, thanks for that.
Yeah, I'd only add, if you're starting things from scratch and just riffing off of what you're describing, really taking the best from from the models that we've seen. So, I'm joined by colleagues that all have living donors with a very clear point of view and a very sort of, replicating their success in the private sector of an urgency and a aggressiveness, I think you described it, that they're bringing to the table. Then you've got foundations that have a longer history in their community, and because of that, also bring the benefit of sort of what the slog that is the work,
Yeah.
and the patience to see it. And so I think if there are two things, sort of making sure that you've got short-term objectives, so you know that you're making impact, but that you've got a super long view, because philanthropy, again, is uniquely situated to have, not just your 5-year strategic plan and let's pivot and try something new, but to be thinking generationally, and also to be developing accountability mechanisms, because while it's not, it has to be self-imposed, but it can be calibrated so that we can ensure that what we're doing is informed by community.
Yeah, and your comment makes me think of, and I know that there is some debate about Newark, and there are folks who argue that there have been better outcomes in the Newark schools, but I think it's fair to say, and not that controversial to say, that that it didn't realize its that the goals were not realized. Certainly the ambitions that were articulated at the beginning of the $100 million plus the $100 million challenge effort and the Oprah appearance, that those were not fully realized. And I had, so your comment about sort of knowledge on the ground, I had a conversation with a funder that had been working in Newark in education for decades, who told me that the foundation was not consulted in the process. So there was no, and I've seen other examples of this, where you have the national funder that literally doesn't even connect, not with the grantees or with the people whose lives they're trying to improve, which you would think would be crucial, but even with the other funders who are rooted in the community. So, so thanks for that. Mark, how about you?
I'll just offer a couple things. Effective advocacy takes longer than you want it to. And the capacity of the governing process to take on new issues and make a lot of change quickly is very limited. And the status quo interests are very well organized to maintain the status quo.
Right.
So having said all that, you know, you've got to be really good at storytelling. And that's something that we're continually working on, because that's how you make the connection. And it's a combination of good data and then good narratives that help bring that data to life. And I know that sounds simple, but you know, that just really is absolutely key to success. And then there'll be moments where windows of opportunity will open for a variety of reasons. And when they do, you have to go and leverage everything you can to take advantage of that moment.
Yeah, and I think an important question there also is whose story?
Yeah.
Whose story are we telling? So I mean, we've been sort of dancing around this critique of philanthropy. I did a debate a few weeks ago at the Ford Foundation with Rob Reich from Stanford, who says, you know, philanthropy is, he's a philosopher, so he thinks of things philosophically. And he says, you know, philanthropy is inherently an undemocratic exercise of power. And he and Anand Giridharadas, author of Winners Take All, Edgar Villanueva, who wrote Decolonizing Wealth, others a few years back, some of whom I alluded to, you know, have a lot of critiques of big institutional giving. One of the things that has surprised me about the response to those critiques, well, is how little of a response there has been, and then the degree to which operating nonprofits, doing work on the ground in communities, in fields, have been sort of overlooked in the conversation, both by the critics. Edgar actually accepted, but I would say in Rob and Anand's case, their books include almost no mention of nonprofits, but also by those in philanthropy who actually have an opportunity to highlight the stories of folks on the ground doing work. So it's just an interesting thing to think about, because I don't think this era of questioning is going away anytime soon. So one of the things that has come up in a number of the questions is, how do you know whether you're having any success? What are the metrics that you use? How do you judge? Any of you want to share a little bit about how you do that? Because this is tough stuff to assess, right, until you get to the point where the law passes and then you know that was a victory. But how do you assess along the way and in the interim?
I'll take a quick stab at it. It's a very important question, and I think it goes to what we've all been talking about up here is there are certain things that we can know, but the most important way that we'll know is by talking to the people who are actually doing the work, and then ultimately the people who are benefiting from the work. And so the answer to your question has to be an inclusive one, and it has to be, I think, an iterative one, because whether you've been at policy advocacy months or philanthropy for 7 years or for decades, whatever it is, the one thing that is an absolute truth is whatever you thought was going to happen, it's going to be different, right? Because we're dealing with the real world. So I think one of the things that's critical here is to establish this kind of a dialogue with a diversity of voices, and that diversity is going to look different on different issues. The other thing that I think is really important and often gets overlooked in conversations about metrics, because we're always looking for that clean, quantitative way of understanding yes or no. And again, almost never does that happen. I think time horizon, as exciting as the concept as that is a very overlooked concept when it comes to this question of metrics. There are certain things you should expect to see in a very short term, and we need those proxies as we think about them. to understand, are things going at least directionally the way that you'd expect them to go if things are going to get better over time. So proxy measures, for instance, for us would be on an issue like immigration. Are people really willing to put some skin in the game in terms of building coalitions with groups that they wouldn't otherwise work with? Now, that's not anywhere near an outcome measure, but that's a proxy on the path to what success could look like over 18 months or over 5 years or over 15 years or over 25 years, like in the case of criminal justice reform.
Right.
And the metrics that you should expect to see over those different periods are going to be different. And so your time horizon is important. And I think this is where philanthropies can either do a whole lot of good in helping grantees to operate within reasonable time horizons relative to their goals. Sometimes those are much, much, much longer than philanthropies would like. The grant officers who want to show success within a 6-month time frame. I think philanthropy can do a real disservice and real harm if we're insisting on unrealistic time horizons, because we're going to skew the incentives to the kind of things that can show those clean, quantitative measures in a 6-month time frame or an 18-month time frame, and we're going to skew the nonprofits that have the opportunity to make a difference to only focusing on those opportunities that fit that time horizon. And almost always, again, hard to talk in absolutes, but almost always, while some are important opportunities in that set of things, they're not the most important things. And so we need to have some humility, again, in terms of what we can know, but there is a role that we play in helping to bring that conversation together and develop those metrics. And I think there's a positive role that we can play, and we ought to be wary not to play a negative role.
Yeah, and I wonder there also whether some of what goes wrong in the measurement conversation has to do with donors who are looking for the kind of simple, quick to move metrics that they're used to in the business world, and sort of underestimating the degree to which this is a different world and requires a different approach to measurement.
Though I would say you see a lot of the same damage done in the business world on the focus on those short-term measures as well. So we can probably take that lesson there too.
That's for sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Other comments on indicators or assessment activities that have been particularly helpful?
It's an issue of ongoing engagement within the foundation, and there are some things you can count, and there are definitely stories you can tell. I think what we try and do is identify in a given policy landscape what critical factors are that we think are going to be influential in shaping the policy debates around priorities that we're focused on, and then scenario out, if things fall one way versus another way, what does that mean strategically for how we operate and support our partners and our coalitions, et cetera. But we've been pretty clear that this is a science and an art.
Yeah.
And that we can't we are limited in the precision with which our metrics can speak to the totality of our influence or our work.
Yeah, my colleagues at CEP, I think, might not let me back in tomorrow if I don't ask, why aren't you talking about feedback from grantees, for example? And not to sound parochial, because that's a big part of what Center for Effective Philanthropy does, is try to elevate that feedback. But wouldn't that be an important interim metric, like, because the folks closer to the ground might have some insight as to whether the strategies are on the right path or not? Not to mention, of course, again, and I've alluded to this before, but the people whose lives you seek to improve, who may or may not be in the position to judge whether you're having success, but they probably are in the position to say something thoughtful about whether that's likely to be helpful or not. What about that? Because I think, by virtue of the roles that you have at the foundations that you have, you are likely to hear, you are more likely than not to hear that people think that your strategy sounds really, really smart. Whether when they're talking directly to you. But are there creative ways that you've sought to burst that bubble and get feedback from folks closer to the ground?
I'll jump in on that and just quickly say feedback to me sounds like you're not in constant contact and interaction with them. So I think we get feedback constantly because we're we're reacting in real time to what we're both seeing and what we're hearing from different partners. So, yeah, I mean, we do look at formal moments and solicit feedback, but it's, you know, it's no substitute for the constant connectivity that you've got to maintain in order to be, you know, sort of effective.
I agree with that, and I think you're not hearing the literal word feedback, because we don't actually view it that way. We think about partnership. So we're a funder, we're not an operator, and so most of the good work we're doing, it's being done by our partners. And so there are some formal moments where we ask for explicit feedback, but our team is in constant dialogue, and I think we bring resources to the table, and we bring connection to our partners and among our partners, and that is how we try to determine, is what we're doing making a difference? And I do hear you that it is hard to get criticism in philanthropy, and that is a challenge for us, and I think it's probably a challenge for all of us. And I would say to any of you, well, there's some value in anonymous surveying. I think it's great, but I'd rather hear directly from the source. I would rather our partners who we fund or don't fund say, hey, look, you screwed that up. Or when you did this, it was great and you should do more of it. And the anonymized, like that's useful, but we're not doing this to make ourselves feel good. We're doing this work because we believe in it as much as our partners do.
Right.
And so I'd rather have the dynamic where they feel comfortable saying the hard thing to us directly.
And Kelly, I agree. Of course, you'd rather have that dynamic. It's impossible, however. I mean, by virtue of the nature of the relationship between the funder and the funded. And I also think that this is not about being well liked. I mean, this is literally about information about how things are going or how things could be better, that it is really hard for funders to get unless they get it in ways that allow grantees to be candid and anonymous, even though of course that's frustrating.
Yeah, I agree with you, not fully, but I do think there is some responsibility on grantees.
I'll take the partial. Yeah. I'll call that victory.
I hear you, but I do think that, and I say this sincerely for the organization that I represent, we don't want you to tell us what you think we want to hear. And I understand we will never achieve a point at which there is just complete, honest communication flow, but we can be more effective if you will tell us what we're doing wrong, what we can do better, and what we should do more of.
Yeah, and I would say, and then we'll broaden it out to another topic, as someone who's been a grantee for 18 years, and who's a big part of my work and CEP's work is trying to elevate the grantee voice through our research, through our grantee perception report. I am not fully candid with our funders. Maybe that makes me a bad person or weak, but that's the reality. So, Malenka, yeah.
I'd just add, first of all, I'm so glad to hear that it's challenging for even the bigs too, right? To wrap your arms around this. I actually agree. I think it's pretty hard, but I do think, at least for folks that are locally on the ground, and this is hard to do too, but we're trying to figure this out to revamp our process for next year and thinking about, surveying beyond our grantees, because that's possible to do when you're local on the ground. There are people that know about your impact that you're not necessarily funding. And we were able to do some of that when we did our strategic reset and got really, really interesting feedback from folks that we weren't in direct relation to, but were able to give feedback.
Great, thank you. And I pushed the metrics conversation because literally about 10 of the questions had to do with that.
That's the one question none of us wanted.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the audience wanted it, so I'm here to serve. So here's a question that I think we have time for. How do you navigate the real power dynamics with respect to co-optation of movements or work? In other words, how do you support folks without essentially, co-opting them or watering down the work?
Well, so I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll give it a shot. I think a lot of what we've talked about is guarding against philanthropies, foundations in a power dynamic changing or insisting on an approach when we are actually not the ones that are in the best position to guide a project. And so I think if that's the intent of the question, or if that's in the spirit of the question, I think it's a really important one. And I think that, first do no harm ought to be, kind of tattooed on the back of our eyes in these positions. And I think that it's got to happen at every single stage of the process. When you start a grant relationship, we try to spend a lot of time with people. And this can be frustrating to grantees. Believe me, I was on the other side of the table for most of my career. But when you do that well and you identify, do you really share vision on this issue, right? Do you want to accomplish the same thing, whether you have different ideas about how to go about that or not? Is this a person or organization that you can be honest with, that you share values with? And are you complementary to them, or are you basically just not bringing much to the table, or they're not bringing much to the table for you? And so that's going to show up, in the future of the relationship. And you really invest in that sort of understanding up front. Then it would almost be absurd, right, for us to say, well, we're going to go against that in our interactions with you. And hopefully, though I take your point about the challenge that grantees have in speaking up to funders, hopefully if you've done that, it's a two-way street. And so in a sense, you have set the table and created the expectation for a much more honest set of feedback in sharing with you, hey, that's not what we had in mind, or we actually tried that 6 years ago, please don't make us do that again, or whatever that feedback is, because that's not criticism. That's, to Kelly's point, that's their role in your partnership, is bringing that local knowledge, that expertise about the issue, and complementing what you can bring to the table. But I think we ought to examine every single one of our processes to understand whether or not we are set up to be true partners, given the realities of the dynamics in the relationship.
Good. One more, speaking of partnership, question from someone who says, basically I'm paraphrasing, look, we don't have an LLC or a C4, but I think wants to work in partnership with other funders. How do you think about working with others who might be more traditional foundations? How important is that to you in your efforts, or can you do it on your own?
We think it's necessary and critical. As I mentioned at the beginning, we can't alone, and even all of philanthropy together, we can't outspend these problems, but we as one organization cannot do it alone. We don't have the knowledge, we don't have the partnerships, we don't have the relationships. And particularly for us, much of what we do is at the state and local level, and so we look to organizations like Malenka's, who can bring not only resources to the table, but those relationships, so we as a national funder will never have. I will tell you, though, we're not great at partnering yet. We aspire to be. It's complicated. Partnering with anyone is complicated, but even partnering among donors has its own unique challenges. But we recognize it's necessary and critical, and we are working to get better at it.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. 30 seconds for each of you. How do you think about partnering with other funders in particular?
I'll be quick. It's essential to what we do. Stand Together is a philanthropic community. We work with 700 individuals who are partnering with us, and that enables us to support literally thousands of social entrepreneurs who are working to find new and better ways to solve problems in society. So everything we do is in partnership.
Great. Malenka?
Well, I'd have to say ditto, but really, we really have to partner, just given our size and scope. But I think responsive to the question about co-opting and owning, I do think that there is an impulse in philanthropy with the pressure of boards and everything else to own something. I think that's a real thing, and I do think when funders come together to collectively support something, that tendency to take it over, to say, this is our brand on it or whatever is diminished. And that works on the other side too. And I certainly know, I talked about the importance of nationals coming in to local communities, as you have and are focused on. But part of that too, for those of us situated locally with our local boards, that are in deep connection for all the good that brings with the mayor and the governor and what have you. When you've got an outside game that's coming together, and you've got folks suing, for example, these key players, there needs to actually be a collective group of funders that can support across that work. And so you're not watering it down because, that's something your foundation might not be comfortable with, but certainly as a shared group, changes the calculus.
Great, thank you. Mark?
Critically important for us as well, and to such an extent that if there aren't good partnership prospects, that's not a great sign for our willingness to go into a place.
Right. It's. I think this is another area where there's such a difference between the business world and philanthropy. Where in business, I always tell people, because I worked as a strategy consultant in the corporate world, you want your strategy to be yours alone. It's a competitive dynamic. It's a zero-sum game. In this world, if your foundation is yours alone, if your strategy rather is yours alone, your foundation's alone, you will surely fail. It has to be shared. I think that this conversation really surfaced the potential and the pitfalls of policy advocacy, and I'll sort of end where I started, which is that I really think it is true that many of the best examples that we can point to of philanthropy really having an impact, nearly all of them have a policy component. So it's crucial to do the work well. And many of the worst examples of philanthropy operating in ways that are less than glorious involve a policy component. I want to close just by thanking Mark, Malenka, Brian, Kelly for being such good sports with all the questions and for coming here and sharing their experience and wisdom today. And thank you all for being here. And thanks to the Urban Institute. Appreciate it. Have a good day, all.